We're going to have Mr. James back in the hot seat. Okay, everyone, welcome back to the Pupil Weighting Task Force. We're going to start some testimony on the homestead tax rate and how we calculate that. We're starting off again with Mr. Brad James from AOE. Okay, whenever you're ready.
Okay, I was just pulling out my copies of my sheet. Since my computer's on, I'll just close it. So now for something completely different. So now we're talking about how the homestead tax is calculated. So it became much simpler. We did the moratorium on the excess spending. I was going to say thank you, Representative Kornheiser.
You're welcome.
You probably didn't hear me, but I thanked you at that time under my breath, so nobody else heard. So I have I had what 5 handouts. Sorsha put them all together as one. Thank you, Sorsha, to make them simpler. So the first one is basic calculation for how you calculate a tax rate. It's actually reasonably straightforward. I made up numbers so they worked, you know, and were easy to do and easy to look at. I just thought of this. I told you last time I was here that I was going to send that Excel file with the pupil calculation, and I never did. My apologies. I'll send you this one too, so you can play with it. I will do that. Hang on, because I will forget. Okay. So this file, see that some of the numbers are red. The numbers that you can change on the Excel file. You're just looking at PDFs, obviously. These are numbers that can change on the Excel file, and it's a working calculation, is what it is. But basically, there are 9 steps to it, or 9 lines to it, I guess. Depends how you choose to define steps. So what you're looking at here is how you calculate a tax rate for a single school district and a single town that belongs to that school district. Okay, so it could be Montpelier, the Montpelier Roxbury. It could be Burlington and Burlington City. It could be Rutland and Rutland City. You know, it could even be Addison Central and one of the towns here. Okay, but in other words, it's a single school district is really what it boils down to. So in this example, what I've done, the line 1 is just the expenditures. When I say expenditures, and I have footnotes kind of at the bottom which says line notes, kind of explaining what each line is for. When I say expenditures, what I'm talking about really is every dollar that the school district is, excuse me, every dollar the school district is going to spend regardless of the source. So this includes federal money, this includes state money for special education, this could include donations, this could include tax money. It's every dollar that the school district is going to spend. Okay, and so it's budget plus a deficit from a prior year that has been audited, and if you to one of the 3 standalone technical centers, CTEs, then once they pass their budget, it becomes a legal obligation of your school district. So that number would be in this number too. So the total expenditures in this case are just over $5 million. Now, when school district boards build school district budgets, they also do an expenditure budget, and they also do a revenue budget. And the revenue budget is those sources of income that are going to come in that are going to offset expenditure, and they should come out to be equal to each other so that when you put them together, it's 0. So you don't have a deficit or a surplus at the end. It never works out the way in reality, but that's how you build the budget. Within that budget revenue, there are certain revenues that have specific that are used for specific purposes, such as federal dollars. Okay, you make money for transportation, you make money for special education, small schools grant or merger support grant. You may have a surplus from a prior year. You may have tuitions coming in, because we were talking about tuition earlier. You may have tuitions coming in, tuition dollars coming in from other schools. So you have all these sources of money that are not going to the tax rate. Those are what we historically call offsetting revenues. And so it's a subset of your total budget revenue is what it is. And they're kind of, a lot of things are listed down in in that line number 2. So in this case, what I did is I simply said, okay, so you have offsetting revenues of $250,000. The number that you care about for terms of tax, in terms of tax purposes, what's called education spending, and that's defined in statute. Basically, it's your total budget less the offsetting revenues. So in this case, that roughly $5 million minus $250,000, and that's line 3. So we have education spending of $4,753,200 in this example. And again, I told you I manipulated these numbers so they work well. So we now know what the district's education spending is. Next step is to look at how many equal pupils we have, which is what this task force is about. So in this case, I'm saying that you have 300 equalized pupils. You take your education spending, divide by your equalized pupils. So in this case, that 4.7 number divided by 300, and you get what's called education spending per equalized pupil. In this case, $15,844. That is the number that drives your tax rate. And if excess spending threshold was still in play, that's the number that we'd be using to apply and calculate with that. But we can ignore that. This is where I say this is where the excess spending threshold goes. I have to say that this time. Thank you, Representative Kornheiser. So if we go down to number 6, we now get to what's called the property yield. Okay, and the property yield, Deb Brighton is going to speak about that right after me, and she'll go into much more detail. So I'm not going to go into much. But basically, the property yield for this current year is $11,317 per dollar of property value. What that essentially means is a way to think of it is that for every $11,317 district spends per equalized pupil, education spending per equalized pupil, your tax rate's $1. If you spend 10% more, your tax rate goes up 10%, so be 10. If you spend 20% more, your tax rate goes up 20%, okay, to $1.20. In this case, when you divide that the spending per pupil line 5, line 6, that 50,844 divided by 11,13,317, you get $1.40. This is where with the manipulation numbers come in well. Okay, so you get $1.40. The equalized homestead tax rate for this school district is $1.40. When we talk about equalized tax rate, what we're talking about is if property value at 100% of fair market value. And up until this year, I've always been able to say there's never been a town that had a CLA, common level appraisal at 100%. One town finally did. The tax are like, whoa, so it's pretty unusual. So we now know what the property, what the tax rate should be if property is at fair market value. In general, it's not in most towns. And so now we adjust the tax rate, the equalized tax rate by the common level of appraisal. That's the CLA line number 8. And that's specific to the town. The tax department does that calculation. And it's a ratio of the town's grand list value to the state's grand list value. The state does it over averaging 3 years worth of data in a number of ways. So if the CLA is below 100%, then that means it's value in its property compared to what the state thinks it's worth. If it's over 100%, then that means the town is undervalued compared to what the state thinks. And a lot of the CLA to come back in high because of the pandemic and people buying properties and such. But we're not worried about that right now. So what you do to get the tax rate that people see on their tax bill is you take the equalized rate and you divide by the common level appraisal. So what is really happening, the dirty little secret here, is that you're being taxed on your fair market value, not on your listed value. It's average for the town. It's not individual properties that we're looking at. It's an average for the town. So in this case, you take the $1.40 divide by 93%, and you get a tax rate of 1.504. That is what the taxpayer would see on their tax bill. And that's how you calculate the tax rate, okay, for a town single district.
Why don't we pause right there? And Representative James.
Yeah. So if I understood it right, and I know we've talked about this in our committee a lot, the equalized homestead rate applies to municipal property and the CLA adjusts between communities.
The CLA is kind of town specific. It's a comparison. You can, if you want to compare your school district / town tax rate to each other, you would use the equalized rate because that's an apples to apples comparison. In reality, though, because you're taxed on what your fair market value, adjust that by the CLA, and that makes it a little more, because the school districts have no say over the CLA, but it's really kind of, it's more or less town specific. The tax department does it, property valuation review does it for each town each year in their annual equalizations. They're looking at sales within each town.
Senator Perchlik?
Just they take the sales in the town as compared to the tax listed.
Yes, and it's an average, it's a 3-year average, what they're usually doing. I'm not an expert on, if you really want to know, Mark would know, and JF, or the property
So with
valuation.
this current market, when does the CLAs go down? Like lower percentage? No, you said they're going up.
Well, you're right, I did say that. A lot of towns, that's what I'm thinking of. Is there reappraising, it's going way up, but you're correct. Reappraising, it should be going down. My apologies. You're right.
Other questions at the? Okay, carry on.
Okay, then that works for, what we just talked about works for most places in the state. However, there are still, even after Act 46, there are still school districts and towns, or I should say towns, that belong to more than one school district. Okay, so if we look at Southwest Vermont, you have an elementary school, a union elementary school called Southwest Vermont Union Elementary District, something like that. I forgot its exact name. You have North Bennington, which is a case district or pre-K 6 district. And then you have Mount Anthony that they all belong to. So each of those school districts calculates its own tax rate up through line 7. Okay, it gets a little bit squirrely. So if you go to the next page where it says homestead tax rate derivation union members, you'll see a simplified example where it is a local school district and a union high school district. So what we're talking about here now is we're going to end up talking about one town belongs to 2 school districts. So the first column under the local elementary school district is exactly what you see through line 7 on the first page. Okay, it's that same elementary school plugged in here. And then I just high school numbers for the column next, just those numbers if you're with the Excel spreadsheet. If you were doing this on the Excel spreadsheet, the numbers in the elementary school would, if you changed on the first page, they're tied to that, the way that file set. But that's irrelevant. So so now we know we calculate the elementary school district tax rate with the exact same high school district in this case, and there's no difference except the numbers are different. So the Union High School has a budget of about 15.7 million. It has also revenues about 2.2 million, and so therefore it has education spending about $13.5 million on line 3. The equalized pupil count at the high school is 700. Okay, and so when you calculate the education spending per equalized pupil, it comes out to just over $19,200. So it's spending quite a bit more per pupil than the elementary school. When you calculate the tax rate by the education spending per pupil and divide by the property yield of 11,317, you get a tax rate of $1. So now you have a town that belongs to a school district with a tax rate of $1.50 and another school district that has a tax rate of $1.70. Add them together straightforward, of course, which is good because it'd be $3.10. Now what we do is now the next step is now we move kind of to town level and we look at where that town's equalized pupil count is going to school. In this case, I'm saying that 60% of their kids, their equalized pupil kids, are going to the elementary school and 40% are going to the high school. So there's 300 going to the equalized pupil to the elementary school. That means there'll be 200 going to the high school and the other 5 from the high school or go some other, or towns plural, we don't care.
Brad, I'm sorry, can you move the mask a little, not the mask, the mic a little worse?
There we go. So the equalized pupil split, the ratio between where the kids are going is 60-40 in this case, elementary school to Union High School. So what you do is simply take 60% of the elementary school tax rate. So 60% times $1.40 is 84 cents on line 9. And you do the same thing with high school. Take 40% of the Union High School tax rate of $1.70 and you get 68 cents. Those are the tax rates that come to the town. You add those together and on line 10 and you get $1.52. The town still has a PLA of 93%. Divide the equalized rate of $1.52 by 93%, and you get a town tax that people will see on their tax bill of $1.6344. And that's how it's done. If you are like some towns up in the North Country supervisor and you have 3, you belong to 3 districts, third column. But again, it gets prorated by the equalized pupil ratio.
There are questions about that? Senator Perchlik?
Can you go over the percentage of equalized pupils? So 300 students in their elementary school, why is that 60%?
Because I'm not showing you how many of their kids are going to the high school. I'm just simply saying. But if you say 60% is 300, that's
So they
50.
might have 500 kids.
Yeah,
total, not
yeah.
300.
Exactly. K-12, pre-12, I should say, they have 500 kids total in that case. And that didn't say that.
Yeah.
That's probably a good thing to say at the top. Say, I'll try to remember that. For example, okay. The other numbers off to the side are the household income percentage. I didn't know if we want to talk about them. I'd rather not. If you want to, we will, but I showed you how to calculate it.
I actually was going to ask if you could just go through that. 'cause
Sure. Let's go back to the first page first then. It's simpler and a little more straightforward. It's fairly straightforward too, but it kind of works the same way. You start.
Senator Brock?
I'm still on your last couple of sentences. And I'm looking at 300, I'm looking at 700.
Okay.
Where did the 500
Okay. I will make a note on this to put that up. So essentially, if we're looking at the elementary school, we've got 60% of this town's kids at the elementary school. It's 300 kids. Okay. So if you divide 300 by 0.6, you get 500. That's how many kids they have in total. Let me put it a different way. If you were to figure out how many kids represents 10% of that population, then if you would divide 60 into 300, you get 50. You get 50 kids for every 10%. So what I'm saying is 60% of their kids are at the elementary school, and I think what's confusing everybody, you're seeing 700 kids at the Union High School. That's made up of 2 or 3 different towns.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, that explains.
Okay. Yeah.
I was looking at 700 plus 300. So
Yeah. Thank you. And again, I will change what's clear to people because I just can't tell here. This is how it works. And I will circle that right now because I'll forget too. And so it's basically that's what we're doing. Okay. It's just I tend to make leaps in case you hadn't noticed. Okay.
And just to clarify, it's not the actual percentage of their kids, it's the percentage of equalized pupils.
Percentage of equalized
Okay.
pupils. That's correct.
Okay, thank
It is not their kids.
It's complicated, so I want to make sure everybody's. Okay.
That's falling off a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're back on the first page, okay, where it's a tax rate derivation, and we're going to look at the household income percentage. The household income percentage starts with that spending per pupil, education spending per equalized pupil. I spending per pupil just because it's shorter, but I mean education spending per equalized pupil. It too gets divided by a yield, but it's a different yield. This is an income yield, and the income yield is larger than the property yield. So the income yield for this year is $13,770. And when you divide 1,584 by 13,770, 115+%. Okay. And then that gets multiplied by 2%, which is the base of the income calculation. So when you take that 115% multiply 2%, you get 2.3%. And so you pay, if you're eligible for income sensitive, pay more than 2.3% of your household income to a certain point. Okay, that's how it works. So that's the calculation. Now the question for a lot of people is, why are the two yields different? Remember, when you're talking about income sensitivity, you're talking about effectively a reduced tax rate because people get money back or they don't pay money out. They get a tax credit. So what that means is that you're actually paying less for the same amount of spending per pupil. That's why the yield is higher for the income than it is for the property tax. You're effectively, for all practical purposes, a lower tax rate because of your income sensitized. You're spending less because you get a tax credit. Does that make sense, folks?
What's the basis for determining income?
Deb Brighton will talk about that. It's essentially how much is what they can be to balance the education. They know the other sources, and then they figure out how much do we need in terms of property taxes. And so that's where it's coming from. Okay. And then if we jump back to page 2, we're now talking about the unions, where a town belongs to more than one school district. It's just, again, like tax rate, same calculation for both districts up to the point where they have their yield or their base income percentage. In this case, the elementary district, again, is 2.3%, and the Union High School district is 2.79%. Again, you take a ratio from the equalized pupil or ratio from the equalized pupils where the kids are going, you multiply. So in this case, you take 60% times 2.3%, you get 1.38%. That's kind of a line 9 way over there to the left. And the school household income percentage is 0.7%. 40% of the town's kids go to there, so they get 40% of that, which is 1.12. You add those two together and you get 2.5%. That's what you pay based on your income. It's a quick, dirty explanation of how it works.
Any questions at this point? Okay.
Okay, then just continue on quickly. I'm just going to show you just kind of where some of the factors change. Obviously, your spending is going to impact your education spending, your overall budget, your offsetting revenues that are going to. But also, in terms of ending up changes in the tax rate, if you go to the next page, it says at the top, it's basic homestead tax rate derivation, change the CLA. And here you have that exact same calculation on the first page. It's in the first column. In the second column, everything is exactly the same up until line 7, or up until line 8, pardon me, whereas at the CLA. In that first example, we divided by the CLA of 93%. In the second column, I've changed that to 85%. And you can see that it changes the tax rate, okay, from $1.50 to $1.64, okay, by changing the CLA. Had I gone up with the CLA, tax rate would have gone down, that people would see on their tax bill. So that's how the CLA is affecting things, just as a very example. And again, on the Excel sheet, you can change the number easily. Okay. See, the CLA changes. The school district has no say over the CLA.
What town is over 100?
Quite a few of them now.
Oh, okay. I thought you were one of them.
No, it was
Okay.
exactly 100. 100.00. That was the unusual part.
Okay, thank you.
No, some of them come in 130% this year. It's like praise. It's like, whoa. So the next page, so that'd be 1, 2, 3, page 4. I guess this would. What I'm doing is I in the property yield. I put the CL back to 93% in that second column, but I changed the property yield. So what I'm saying, again, Deb Brighton will talk about this, is I'm saying that the state has a little bit more money per pupil. So the yield went up from 11,317 to 11,400. When you divide by that same spending per pupil, you get a slightly lower equalized tax rate, $7.40. It rounds to $1.39, about a penny lower. And then you divide by the CLA, the actual tax rate is also about a penny lower. Okay. Again, so you're seeing that the yield makes a change on things. And then the last page is what we're here to talk about as in these meetings, equalized pupil count. In this case, again, everything's the same in the first column. In the second column, means the equalized pupil counts. I pushed them up by 10. So instead of 300, you're by 310. The spending per pupil drops from 15,844 to 15,332. So it's a drop of about just over $500 per equalized pupil. That impacts the tax rate by dropping it from the equalized rate on line 7 by dropping it from $1.40 to about $1.35. And then when you divide by that CLA of 93%, you get that $1.50 I've seen before, now about $1.4546. So change of the equalized pupils with nothing else changing also significantly changes your tax rate that people see on the bill. And that's what we're talking about. Nothing else changes except equalized pupil weights. Okay. And when you put all these factors together, that's when you really get confused.
So are we all confused or?
Or just me.
You have questions on it? Sen Brock.
Just a question, making sure that I understand what this chart represents. What it's saying here is that the number of equalized pupils increases. That might involve, let's say, an increase in children in poverty, increase of people who need second language learning. And so you have an increased number of those kids in a district, and the tax rate goes down.
Yes.
Okay, and I'm just trying to understand why.
Simply because I'm showing you how it affects things. I did not, in other words, one of the factors that we're not talking about here is up here in line 3, the education spending, which is the result of your budget and your offsetting revenues. I didn't change that. Okay, so in reality,
that you had this situation, the district would spend more money.
probably
That would have an effect.
right.
But there's no guarantee that will happen.
That's
There's nothing that we're doing regarding setting tax rates, not tax rates, but the methodology that has anything to do with actually doing anything for the equalized kids.
that's been one of the points of discussion is that in order to do this, it's not meant to be a tax change in tax rate reduction for those towns who are going to get a higher equalized. It's meant to say you have more capacity to spend on these kids that you raise money and spending is really what it's saying.
Guarantee or no imperative that anybody does anything
That's right.
about the things that we do.
That's correct. And currently, that's correct. And again, all I was doing here was just keeping everything constant except for one variable, just showing how it changes
I
things.
just wonder why we're doing any of this.
Well, and Senator, that's exactly sort of at the heart of
Yeah.
our conversations of how to, yes, no, you are totally under. Yes,
Thank you.
absolutely.
Certainly.
Are there other questions or comments at this point? Representative comment or you, okay. Okay, anything else, Brad, at the moment? Still close, Still close. Did you have more or you?
No, that
Okay.
was it. I wanted to kind of run through that fairly quickly, dazzle you guys, see how you did with it.
We are dazzled.
Okay.
Thank you, as always, this was helpful. And I think our next witness, Deb Brighton, is on Zoom. There she is. Hi, Deb, how are you?
Hi, fine.
You are going to be talking to us about the yield portion of the program, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, excellent. So why don't you just 1 second. Go ahead.
Just wanted to let our studio audience know that we're aware that the sound is a little bit off and the tech support is working on it, but the closed captioning still seems to be working as well as it ever does.
As well as it ever does. All right, so there might be a little bit of a delay. Deb, why don't you just introduce yourself for the record and then go ahead with your testimony, and then I'm sure we'll have questions for you.
Thank you. So I'm Deb Brighton, and I'm working as a consultant to the Joint Fiscal Office. But I will say that I've been doing this for a very long time, even longer than Brad. And Brad mentioned that I would go into more detail about the yield, but actually he covered all the detail. So I'm going to give you sort of the bigger picture about why we use the yield, where the number comes from, and how we got to the system, I guess. And I'd like to start with the Brigham decision. And I know that you'll get more on this later in the afternoon, but what I wanted to really focus on was how the yield relates to the Brigham decision. And that's because part of the, I guess the bulk of the decision concentrated on the disparity that they saw in the ability of towns to raise education revenue. And I think that the very last conversation that I heard between Brad and Senator Brock really got at this issue of what we're looking at here is tax capacity. And that's really what the Brigham decision focused on. And so I went up into my barn and I found some pre-Brigham charts. And there are 3 charts up
And
on
these
the
are on-
website.
Yeah, they're on the website. Look at them.
It says yield slides or yield charts or something. So the first one is from fiscal year 1994, pre-Brigham. It's what we were struggling with at that time. And what it's showing you, it's sort of hard to see. It's a really old paper copy that I tried to put up here, but it shows, well, if you look at it from a distance, it looks sort of like a landscape with a valley on the left and then a mountain on the right. If you look at it more carefully, you can see that it's actually made up of 252 little bars, each representing a town. And the height of the bar is showing you the amount that that town could raise at that time per pupil with a 1 cent, a penny tax rate. And so on the left side, the towns can raise very little on a penny tax rate, like $10, and then you go per pupil, and then you go all the way up the mountain, and you find out that they can raise 50 times more, or they could at that time, 50 times more per penny. So the chart would actually look exactly the same if it showed grand list per pupil, and you just change the title and you change the access title, but it would be that same proportion. So the property wealth per pupil varied from around $100,000 per pupil to $5 million per pupil at that time. Or in terms of grand list, which is 1% of property value, it went from around $1,000 to $50,000. But no matter how you look at it, the disparity was 50 to 1. And the extreme difference, because of the mountain on the right, sort of masks the less extreme differences that you see. But you can see in the middle, there are towns that had, say, 3 times or 2 times the tax capacity of the lower towns. So if you were a bulldozer operator and you wanted to make a level playing field and you saw this landscape, you would bulldoze in the mountain to fill in the valley, make it a level playing field. But at that time in Vermont and in most of the country, we didn't do that. What we wanted to do, we focused on just pulling up the valley. So just giving towns with the lowest wealth some supplemental aid. And the second chart has a line, sort of a horizontal line in the lower left. It says aid level. And that's sort of what an illustration of what we did. We would provide aid to the towns below the line and just sort of bring them up to the line. And we had all sorts of different kinds of formulas. So we went through every 10 years or so, changed the formula. But that was the idea. But there were 2 problems with this approach. The first is, where do you get that dirt to fill it in? You're not getting it from the mountain. So you have to get the dirt from somewhere else. And so what happened was we would start with a higher line. And then as the years went on, we would let the line drop down. We'd have a harder and harder time finding that dirt to fill it in. And fewer towns were receiving it. So there were fewer and fewer votes for it. And the line went down. And then every 10 years, we'd have another formula. We start a little higher and it would go down again. The second problem was that even when you do that, even if the line were a little higher, there's still a vast disparity in the ability to pay. So the Supreme Court was pretty convinced that this disparity in wealth made a difference in education spending. And at the time, they quoted a Department of Education report that said, this is a quote, "A statistically significant relationship exists between the wealth of the school district and its spending per student. Based largely on this relationship, there continue to be large disparities in per pupil spending across school districts." And the decision went on to say, another quote, "The undisputed evidence thus amply supports the plaintiff's claim that wide disparities in student expenditures exist among Vermont school districts, and that these disparities correlate generally with taxable property wealth within the districts." So the next question was, does this result in unequal education opportunities? And they said that while we recognize that equal dollar resources do not necessarily translate equally in effect, there is no reasonable doubt that substantial funding differences significantly affect opportunities to learn. To be sure, some school districts may manage their money better than others, and circumstances extraneous to the educational system may substantially affect a child's performance. Money is clearly not the only variable affecting educational opportunity, but is one that the government can effectively equalize. They said equal educational opportunity cannot be achieved when property-rich school districts may tax low and property-poor school districts must tax high to achieve even minimum standards. Children who live in property-poor districts and children who live in property-rich districts should be afforded a substantially equal opportunity to have access to similar education revenues. They didn't weigh in on exactly what equal education opportunity is, and they didn't deal with the claim about taxpayer equity. And I think some people believe that that was what they dealt with, taxpayer equity, but it wasn't. They really were looking at educational opportunities, and what they felt they could deal with was substantially equal opportunity to have access to similar educational revenues. So that was our task. And what we did was to, rather than to look at that line and sort of move the line up or down or whatever, we did what the bulldozer operator would do. And we decided we're going to give every town the same grand list per pupil. So one part of it was that we now levy a uniform statewide education tax on non-residential property. And then we add this, we created the education fund. We put this into the education fund and we add to it all the other non-property tax revenue that's dedicated to education. And now it's like the sales tax, portions of the meals and rooms tax, lottery, et cetera, all the things that go into the education fund. And we would use it to effectively give the same property value per pupil to every town. So and we calculate this every year. And in FY22, the amount of property value behind each pupil is $1,131,700. Or because the grand list is 1% of the fair market value, it would mean that each pupil has $11,317 in grand list value behind a student. Does that number sound familiar?
Yes.
It is the yield. So essentially it's saying, because each student has $11,317 in grand list behind it, and you have a dollar rate, what do you get? You get $11,317 per pupil. So essentially, that was our very direct response to the Brigham decision, was to just set up, give every student equal grand list behind it in every district. And so that's the basic reason for it. And Brad took you through all of the steps of how we use that to calculate your tax rate. We could have, on the other hand, said to everybody, okay, base your tax rate by taking your number of students, multiply it by this grand list value, and then use the ratio between your education spending and the new grand list to come up with your rate. It would be the same thing. So the third chart is showing you where we ended up. And that is, it looks absolutely completely different. It looks much more like a level playing field. It's not exactly level. So the reason that it's not exactly level is, you can probably guess, it's that instead of using per pupil, per ADM, which is what this chart is showing, we gave the equal grand list amount to equalized pupils. So it looks fairly straight per ADM, but there is a slight difference. It goes sort of plus or minus 6% from the average based on the current weighting that we have now. And I think I should point out that the current weighting that we have the grade weighting is significant, but it doesn't show up at the town level because at the town level, everybody has some high school students and some elementary students. They have a mix. So you don't see the weighting caused by the equalized pupils. That is more getting it to the right school. But the town rate is, the equalized pupil at the town level is much more affected by those other weights, which are much smaller. And I think that the other thing that's interesting to know, I know you'll talk about this later, but the difference between categorical aid and weighting students. So a lot of those sort of, a lot of the differences between towns that towns cannot control, that the school district can't control, have been in categorical aid, which sort of purifies the education funding that goes on the yield. It sort of purifies that the education spending definition that we're looking at providing equal access to.
Okay. Are you finished? Do you have more to add? I don't want to interrupt you, but.
Well, I was going to not get into the income yield at that point and just make sure that that this is clear.
Yes. So are there questions for Ms. Brighton at this point? Senator Brock.
Just wondered if there is some place in writing that details how the yield is calculated and used.
No, and there should be. And if you want it, I can give you like a short answer about how it's calculated. And that is essentially that we take, Brad estimates education spending, then we subtract from it all the non-homestead revenue that we'd be getting in. And then we end up, theoretically, we could take the remainder that we need and divide by the grand list and come up with a rate. But because we're allowing each town to decide how much they're spending, it would be different. We look at the town spending per pupil to weight the grand list. So if one town spends 20% more than average, their grand list will be weighted by 20% higher, 1.2, and another town that spends 80% of average, we'll lower the amount, and we come up with a weighted grand list. And then we divide that into the amount that we need, basically. We ended up, and we come up with a rate. And let's say the rate is $1.50, to use easy numbers. And the average equalized spending per pupil is 15,000. Then we would say, we can calculate from that $1 would yield 10,000.
Sorry, Representative Beck.
Yeah, just a comment to Senator Brock's question is it's in statute how the yield is calculated.
Well, that's my question.
Yeah. Statute.
Yeah, that's my
Yeah,
question.
it's a good idea. I think it's kind of a black box to people. Maybe I should point out one other thing that is in statute is that the tax commissioner has to come out with an estimate in December of the yields and the rates. And statute does say that we should calculate it so that the percent change in the homestead, the bill of the people who pay on homestead, or the bill of the people who pay on income, or the bill of the non-residents would increase by a similar percentage.
Is there, to Senator Brock's question, and it's in the statute, but Is it possible or would it be helpful to the committee to have a one-page, similar to what Brad has shown us, how tax rates calculated? Similar kind of thing to show how the yield is calculated? Abby can do that. Can you do that for us? Awesome. Thank you very much. Okay. Are there other questions for Ms. Brighton at this point?
Thank you. So thank you for the journey you took us on from the barn to different charts. I very much loved it. And I hope you stay or have taken this to a much wider audience because it's a really effective way of having the conversation. So if I appreciate the language you used about sort of the amount of dollars and behind each pupil. I think because I'm a very visual thinker, it sort of helps me get my head around this. And what I'm trying to get my head around now is so each student has the same amount of dollars standing behind them on behalf of their educational future or experience. We know that some students need more dollars behind, and that's sort of why we see the weights. I guess I'd ask you if you could extend that metaphor or the way that you're telling the story to that next stage for me. Does that make sense as a question?
I think so.
Okay.
So let's see. So the Supreme Court decision called for substantially equal access to education resources. And they were looking at it per pupil. We weighted students. We did two things. We had categorical aid and we weighted students. So the categorical aid takes it out of that equal access to educational opportunity resources pool and says, okay, we know you, in addition, you need something else to provide the same education that would be provided for on the yield. And so that keeps the amount that's going per pupil fairly equal in terms of the accessing the general education spending resources. And if we did it, so we have the choice now. We're recognizing that the weighting is off. And so if we have the choice now of how we would change the weighting, the extent to which it changes the equalized pupils, it will change that sort of equal access to education spending. The chart will look completely different. Is that wrong? No, I mean, but it is a different way of thinking about how we're doing this, given the systems was set up as a response, direct response to the Brigham decision. So I think if you use the recommended weights and change the equalized pupil count, you would end up having some towns have twice the tax capacity as other towns. Is that still substantially equal? Probably. It's just a different way of looking at it. The alternative would be to keep what's defined as education spending very uniform and deal with more of the special circumstances outside of the control of the town and the school district with categorical aid.
And so I think I heard you say that the construct that we're operating with now was sort of imagine that things that were outside of the district's control would be handled through categorical aid, and things that were within the district's control would be handled through the individual budgets. I think of poverty as being deeply outside the district's control. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And so if we were staying sort of with the original construct as you described, we would do a lot of students or families that contribute to their educational outcomes, but are outside of the school's control through categorical aid. And we would continue to use it as a method of equalizing revenue opportunity within the districts.
Yes.
Okay,
Representative Conley.
Deb, you, I just want to clarify something. When you talk about money behind a student or grand list behind a student, it's actually behind an equalized pupil. Is that correct?
Well, the Supreme Court was talking about behind an ADM. And so all these charts show behind an actual pupil. We calculate the yield using equalized pupils. So therefore, that's how we interpreted it, to say we want the same grand list behind each equalized pupil. That's why the chart doesn't look perfectly straight when you use an ADM.
Right.
Okay. I just wanted to point out the captioning is helpful, but when Brad was talking, he was talking about brutalized pupils instead of equalized.
I think it's 90-something% accurate. I can't remember what the latest term is. It's gotten better and better. Are there other questions for Deb at this point? This has been really helpful. I love the visuals. Thank you for going out to your barn and finding the original document. I think we'll probably be hearing more from you over the course of the fall as we start to make decisions and you start modeling them for us, is my understanding. So thank you so much for being here with us today, and we'll see you again soon, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we are going to move on to the hold harmless for it should be equalized pupil provisions, not ADM provisions. And I believe it's not bad. It is Mark. So we're only a few minutes behind, so we're doing okay. Yes, that's true.
Good morning, Mark. Can you hear me? Yes.
I think so. Are we
Okay.
all good? Can we hear?
So Mark Broughton, the Joint Fiscal Office. I think this will be a little bit more straightforward. I gave myself the task this morning for explaining this. What I'm going to do is explain the whole harmless provision that's in current law and try to talk a little bit about how it relates to the work that you're doing here. When I was getting ready this morning to think about what I was going to present to you, I went back over the legislative history, which has been quite involved with this provision for a relatively small provision. So to make you understand what the relevance might be for your work, I'm going to have to delve a little bit into what the law was and what it had been and what it is now. But I'm not going to, unless you want me to, I'm not going to go through every little detail. There was a lot of work around Act 6 that affected this, and we'll cover. So anyway, the latest iteration of hold harmless provision was enacted just this past session in Act 3. And the provision that was put in place then, the one we, I think, similar to one we had a couple of years ago, and it simply says that no district shall lose more than 3.5% of its equalized pupil count in any one year. If it loses more than that, they're held harmless at the 3.5% loss. I didn't find anything on what the intent behind this was, but I think it's safe to assume that the idea is that if a district is losing a significant number of kids, its education spending per pupil is going to go up. Consequently, their homestead tax rate is going to go up. That's immediately, and the district doesn't necessarily have time to change in terms of deploying teachers differently or configuring their class size the same way. So it's just a provision that recognizes that districts need time to make adjustments as they're losing kids. Now, to get back into the history of this a little bit, you may remember there were several years ago, there were lots of discussions about pupils and problems around that like. And the reason for that is the way that this was originally drafted, district that's lost 10% of their kids in 1 year would then have a 3.5% hold harmless applied each year, looking back to the hold harmless number, not the actual number. And so you were consistently losing kids over time, which some districts were, say 5%. You'd never really catch up with the 3.5% hold harmless, and you'd get an increasing number of what we call phantom pupils in calculation. So there are a bunch of changes between Act 46, but the main change that was dealt, rather than looking back to the whole pupil count in the prior year in this calculation, you look back to the actual count. So if you lost 10% of your kids in 1 year, the first 3.5% limit how many kids you lost. But then in the next year, you measure from the actual number of pupils. If it was rolled out, that would be that 1 year of adjustment. Am I losing? Okay. Okay. Yeah. So the difference was previously we looked at the hold harmless count in the prior year to determine if you were losing 3.5%. Now the actual count in the prior year, regardless of what the hold harmless count was. Okay. So in terms of this, we were thinking it's in effect, it would be a transition measure because you're looking at changing the pupil count. This provision that's in place right now would say you're a district that loses pupils as a result of the new weights. Your per pupil is going to go up, your tax rate is going to go up. You would be protected in the first year. Your pupil count could only drop by 3.5%. But the way the law is drafted right now, that would be the end of your benefit. In the following year, you'd have to go back up to your actual, so you'd have to absorb it all. Under the prior law, say if you lost 10% of your kids, you would have been protected 3 years before you got back to your actual number. So I think that the way the law is drafted right now, it probably would not work as an transition device for moving to new rates, simply because it would only provide 1 year benefit. And some districts are going to have a significant loss, and you might want to stretch it out over time if you go ahead with that. That would require changing the law. If you went back to what we had, then it would also raise the issue we had previously, which is phantom students in the mix. And if you have a really significant drop in your pupil count, the 3.5% limit would mean that we'd be shifting that out over a number of years. So I think you'll probably come back to this once you've decided what to do with the pupil rate, so we can look at it when we get talking about transition. This might come back, but I think the way it's drafted right now, it probably wouldn't serve as an effective transition device going forward. So,
Okay, Representative Kornheiser.
Do we have any mechanisms if the actual student count goes up?
was there one? So
There once was one, but there was gone, says someone who did not have a microphone. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you might want to ask more about it because I wasn't aware of that. So,
And then I remember us, and it's really embarrassingly vague memory of particular COVID provisions and how we sort of did more holding harmless on ADM.
yeah,
this
that
last
was a
year?
separate provision. Yes, we had a provision that just sort of held everything harmless for when that's why I said this. The legislative history around this is really
Sorry.
it's involved
Uh-huh.
because under Act 46 we used it as an incentive to get districts to merge,
Mhm.
and then phased it out. And there was I can I did it this morning and I can give it to you later if you're interested.
Okay.
But that provision of the ADM, not equalized pupils.
Thank you.
So, but right now, back to where we were a few years ago, just a straightforward 3.5% hold time provision that affects all districts.
Representative Beck.
Does that, the 2-year 80 average dampens this out also going up and going down? So,
Yeah, so we could do like a rolling average over 2 or 3 years moving forward.
Ways you could do it,
Yeah.
but you'd be involved effectively creating phantom kids for a number of years out, depending on how you did it.
Right.
But
And-
it might be a better way to do it than just arbitrarily setting a specific length of time or something like that, because different districts are going to be affected more than others.
And to Representative Kornheiser's point, you've mentioned that there are districts that are going to decrease. They're going to have a huge drop in their equalized pupils because of potential changes in weights or
Right.
what we do. And there are districts that have a huge increase or could, depending on what we do. And we could do a sort of
Yeah, you can do
hold
both
harmless
sides.
that would
Sure.
phase that in as well,
Yep.
too. Yeah,
Yep.
okay. Are there other questions at this point? Okay, I think
Okay.
that's it for
All right.
now. We're gonna hear from Sue Siglowski. Are you still with us? It's like magic. It's so cool.
Yes, I'm still here.
Thank you for bearing with us and holding on. You were gonna provide some testimony from the perspective of the School Boards Association. If you wanna just introduce yourself again and go ahead.
Yes, Sue Siglowski, Executive Director of the Vermont School Boards Association. And I just have some brief testimony on this topic. I am having a little bit of trouble here. The audio is a little spotty on my end. I'm not sure if that's something that's coming from your end or mine, but so I may not always hear everything you're saying, but I'll try.
Yeah, sorry that we do know about it, and I think somebody's trying to work on it. But thank you for letting us know. And we will all try to speak directly into the mic too, and hopefully that will help.
Okay, thank you. So I just have brief testimony on this issue because the agenda indicated that it was hold harmless provisions for ADM, and I think you're actually really more focused on equalized pupils. But I did want to mention, as was briefly referred to, that there was Act 154 of 2020, which established that each school district's 2020-2021 school year average daily membership, which is the ADM, would not be less than the previous year. And at that time, we did support that stabilizing measure because it was providing one predictable measure for school districts as they were developing their FY22 budgets. That was during a time when we didn't even have vaccines approved yet. We're unfortunately, we're seeing, we had hoped to see ADM bounce back up as the pandemic subsided. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is that the impacts of the Delta variant maybe are going to be having a negative effect on ADM during the upcoming school year as well. Earlier this week, the Agency of Education informed us that its home study team is currently experiencing an increase in student enrollments, many of which had been submitted in the past few days at the time that they issued that notification. So there is still some instability caused by the Delta variant. And so that's something to keep in mind. But I know here what you're talking about really, I think is a longer term view. And I think it's, I was, educated by Mark's testimony about the current provision that was in Act 73 of 2021 on equalized pupil hold harmless type provision would not be effective as a transition device. So I think that's something to take a closer look at. But as I said, I wasn't really aware that that was what you were going to be focusing on. So I don't have detailed testimony on that today. Thank you.
Okay. Apologies for that, Sue. I'm sorry. We should have talked about that earlier this week to get clarity, and I apologize for that. And I just want to make sure I heard you just correctly. You don't think that the equalized pupil hold harmless would be an effective transition measure, or you do? I'm not sure I heard you correctly.
It could be used as a transition measure, but I believe what I heard Mark Peralt, was that as it's currently written in the law, it would not be effective in that manner. Right. As it's currently written.
As it's currently written, and we would have to make changes. And luckily, we do that.
Right.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Are there questions? Did Representative or Senator? Okay. Anyone else? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Sue. I'm sure we'll hear from you at a later meeting as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we are actually done a little early for the morning, which is amazing. Unless there's anything people want to say before lunch. We're going to take an hour break for lunch, so try to be back here at 1:10. So we can get started. Our afternoon is going to be briefer because we have, unfortunately, Professor Colby is ill and will not be able to join us this afternoon. And we're going to also hold off on Brianna Parker's testimony on the rurality and sparsity because her testimony sort of builds on Professor Colby's testimony. So just so you know, we'll hear from the superintendents and the other witnesses under there, but we're going to have to come back to that issue when Professor Colby is available. So we'll have a shorter afternoon, hopefully, not what. Okay, so we're going to go offline and for lunch.